would like to welcome everyone very much to joining our 6th Climate Justice webinar. My name is Jessica Besch and I am a program officer at the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens, and I will be your moderator for today. And I'm particularly excited about this webinar because today we will discuss the climate change from a little bit of a different angle, and these angles are art and culture. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook, and the last 30 minutes of the agenda are reserved for the Q&A. So kindly put all of your questions to our panelists in the Q&A box, and we will try and answer all of them. So while creating this webinar series with our partners at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, I really wanted to include a session about creative communication and advocacy strategies for climate action. Why is that? Because on individual level, I'm really curious about art in all its forms and realize the impact that it has on myself and others. And also, I'm constantly communicating with the rest of the world via the internet and social media, and have experienced its potential for global information exchange that benefits grassroots organizations and activism in general. On a professional level at the Ban Ki-moon Center, because in order to achieve our goal and mission, to empower women and youth to act as global citizens in the framework of the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement, we need to create a unique communication strategy that attracts young change makers, policymakers, and donors alike. The SDGs, global citizenship, and the climate emergency are quite complex topics that can often overwhelm people. So how do we deal with this across different sectors? How can we use art, design, and culture as a tool to reach a wider audience for our common goal for the people and the planet? And why is a multi-stakeholder approach crucial for a sustainable, peaceful, and inclusive world? And I'm very happy that I can discuss this today with environmental journalist and Atmos climate editor Yessenia, Earthrise co-founder Harries, and Curating Tomorrow founder McGhie. And I would now like to briefly introduce our amazing speakers before diving into the panel discussion. So first of all, Yessenia, she's an environmental journalist covering the racial and social intersections. She's currently the climate editor for Atmos, a climate and culture magazine focused on telling heart and human-centered stories on the climate crisis. Atmos prints a magazine twice a year focused on fashion, aesthetics, and art. Yessenia has been published in Vogue, Gizmodo, Grist, Patagonia, and more. She was the recipient of the 2019 Seal Environmental Journalism Award, and alongside journalists from the New York Times, Time Magazine, and The Atlantic. I'm very happy that you are here with us today, Yessenia. Then we also have as a speaker, thank you. Then we also have as a speaker Harries, who is a British designer and filmmaker. He is the co-founder of Earthrise Studio, a digital media company dedicated to communicating the climate crisis through research, design, and filmmaking. He's currently studying at the University of Cambridge to complete an MPhil in architecture and urban design. His research focuses on the intersection of ecology, design, and climate change. Welcome, Finn. And last but not least, we have McGhie, who has a background as an ecologist, museum curator, and senior manager. He set up Curating Tomorrow to support museums and similar organizations to enhance their contributions to sustainable development agendas, including the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, climate action, biodiversity conservation, and human rights. He is a member of the team behind Reimagining Museums for Climate Action, the AHRC Heritage Priority Area contributing to the UK's time as host of COP26. He's also the co-editor of 2 books on climate change communication and of a series of guides on museums and sustainable development agendas. So as you all see, we really have experts here today, and I'm really looking forward to learning from you. And thank you so much for joining. I would dive right into the panel and start with you, Yessenia. And could you please tell us a little bit more about your work as a climate editor at Atmos and also Atmos itself? And I have to admit that the Frontline newsletter written by you is actually the only newsletter that I read. So congratulations on that. And yeah, what is it in your eyes that makes the magazine so special, and how do they communicate climate justice issues to their audience?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, Jessica. I think this would be a great moment to show the viewers a little taste of what Atmos looks like. So as Jessica mentioned so beautifully, we publish a magazine twice a year. Atmos does our print magazine, and for us, our big focus is tackling storytelling from multiple mediums. So we have our print magazine, which we print twice a year. And I don't feel like magazine is quite enough to describe what our publications are. They really are almost like books. That's how some of our contributors have described them. And we also publish our newsletters, which Jessica talked about. I publish the Frontline twice a week. Our editor-in-chief, Willow Diffabach, publishes their newsletter once a week. And we also have our Instagram, which is where we probably have the most reach. We have about 116,000 followers, I think, right now. It's just like always ticking upwards, so I can't keep track, but it's where we also communicate digitally the stories that we have in our magazine, the stories that we tell in our newsletters, and of course the features that we also tell online on our website. And for us, you know, the big I guess mission here is telling these climate-centered stories, because you know, Atmos has only been around, I think, about 3 years now, and you know, we entered the media realm with a really clear vision of the stories we wanted to tell, and the approach we wanted to take to telling these stories. You know, climate change has been an issue for decades. And I would argue that the media has truly failed the public in helping communicate the urgency and the immediacy of the issue, and also in bringing in diverse voices into the mix. And so as you see here, here's one of our latest features on Patagonia, who is an advocate for the outdoor space. He's a gay man, and he's also a drag queen, and a big part of his platform is making room for BIPOC and other members of the LGBTQ community. And that's a big part of our ethos at Atmos. We're a pretty queer staff, and so that's a big part of our identity. We're a very diverse staff as well, so that really plays a big part in the stories we tell. The Frontline in particular is focused on environmental justice and climate justice, but not just, you know, reporting and data and science, which is all very important, but also the emotional aspect of the climate crisis, because for so long, journalists like myself were told that, you know, we couldn't feel our feelings about this, and we have to remain objective and just state the facts. And I don't think that really helped push along efforts to address the climate crisis. And so for us, it's about being, you know, honest with ourselves and getting emotional and getting real, and making sure that folks who are experiencing the climate crisis have a seat at the table, and their voices come through in our stories. So really glad to be a part of this team, and really hope that you will read Atmos if you don't already.
Thank you so much, Yessenia. And I think, yeah, what really got me now is that you said getting honest. And this is also what I get when I read Atmos, because it's not only scientific facts, which is of course also very important, but we want to reach everyone, and we want to tell different stories, because it's not only one perspective, it's not only the Western side of the climate crisis story. So this is really something that comes across really well as a feedback. And I would now move to Finn, to my second question. How did Earthrise Studio came to life, and what tools do you utilize to communicate the climate crisis so that it's graspable for a wider audience? You also have a lot of followers on Instagram. How do you get people engaged in the topic, and what are also maybe important partnerships that you build to pursue the organization's goal? I'm thinking now, for example, about the Green Ideas book club that you just launched with the Penguin books. Yeah, maybe just tell us a little bit more about Earthrise Studio.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jessica. And Yessenia, it's really an honor to sit beside you. Atmos is an account we've followed some time, so I feel like we're in very good company. I'm going to share my screen as well, if that's all right, and you can tell me if this works. Hopefully it will. So let me just do that now. Go full screen. Can you see the Earthrise logo?
Yes.
Is that changing there? Did you see a slide change?
No, it's not changing now.
Interesting. Okay, that happens when you go full screen sometimes. I might just keep it here even though you're getting the ugly borders. You can see the change now. Yeah, okay, we'll just go from here. Cool, so yeah, so I thought it's really important to sort of give a quick introduction for anyone watching that doesn't know about Earthrise or anything about me, just to sort of make sure we're all on the same page. And so we were born sort of just over a year ago, obviously out of the climate crisis, but also out of other events that were happening in the world, like the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And Earthrise primarily uses creativity to communicate the climate crisis and to advocate specifically for climate justice. And we do that by publishing our own editorial work, similar to Atmos, and producing digital media, whether that's video or audio or graphic. And our aim is really to engage a young and dedicated audience who are what we would call climate curious. And so we're founded on this sort of very simple idea, which is that we need a new perspective. The climate crisis obviously isn't a recent discovery. This is something we've known about for sort of 40, even 50 years. But the story up until now has been one that's been told in a way to seed doubt, confusion, and a sort of whole range of emotions that ultimately and conveniently, for sort of vested interests, have led to very little action being taken on the crisis itself. So we draw our name from and our sort of inspiration from this sort of seminal period at the end of the 1960s. The picture Earthrise, which was taken by Bill Anders on the sort of Apollo 8 space mission, encapsulates a shift in mindset where many recognized a bigger picture, that really we are all just humans sharing and stewarding this beautiful but vulnerable floating rock, and that our lives are made possible by an intricate network of living systems and feedback loops that need to remain in equilibrium in order to function. So our main outlet, as you mentioned, or for sort of publishing is Instagram. We engage over 200,000 people every day on a range of topics, covering things like climate science, indigenous wisdom, regenerative culture. And we try to cultivate both a sense of urgency, but also a sense of optimism and possibility. And we use this space also to feature diverse voices that are normally marginalized from this conversation. We also have a website where we share blog posts and publish some of the projects we're working on. And I want to talk just briefly about this sentence that you'll see on our homepage and in our bio, "Another world is possible." We use this tagline a lot to capture our ambition and a sort of sense of stubborn optimism. But I think for me, most importantly, it highlights the depth of systemic change that needs to happen. So when we say another world, we really mean another system, because climate change isn't the problem, is the symptom of a set of practices that are fundamentally extractive and degenerative. And so we really need to rebuild from the ground up in order to address the problem at its root cause. I found my way to this work over quite a long period of time. I'm a second generation climate activist. Unfortunately, that's me in the left, barely able to see through a mop of hair. And I grew up with this amazing mother who sort of dragged me along throughout my childhood to climate protests and taught me that it was okay to stand up for what I believed in. And so I've sort of followed her footsteps and carried that sign forward to many protests since. And on the right there are the two other co-founders of Earthrise. One is Jack, who's my identical twin brother, and the other, Alice Adey, who's a documentary filmmaker, and just to keep the dynamic interesting, is the partner of my brother. And so we've been asking this question, which is what this panel is all about, which is how do you use creativity to better communicate the climate crisis and advocate for climate justice? And I just want to touch very quickly on two projects. You mentioned a penguin one. I'm going to talk about two others very quickly. The one is called The Breakdown, and this is a 5-part video series in collaboration with Water Bear Network. Each episode runs about 10 minutes to give the viewer a complete foundation of where we are today. So we try and look at the past, the present, and the future through the lens of science, policy, and culture, to try and make sure people are understanding the issue from as many angles as possible. And you can find that on YouTube and Instagram. And another recent project is Choose Earth, and this is a campaign to support frontline indigenous activists in the Brazilian Amazon through a radically direct funding model. So despite the fact that Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the global population, it's estimated that they protect 80% of biodiversity. And Indigenous people are a great example of a marginalized group on the front lines of the climate crisis, despite contributing the least to the issue. And this campaign is a partnership with Choose Love, and we sort of leverage the momentum around Earth Day each year to raise funds and support Indigenous communities in their fight to protect their homeland. And so I'll just finish with this, which is a sort of good way to sum up where we stand. So we believe in the power of storytelling and the strength of community to inspire a new generation of change-based visionaries and activists. And I think what's important about that is that it's not about me or Earthrise, but a much bigger picture of how this sort of work ripples across the web to inspire other people to take action in their own lives. And obviously Atmos and other accounts like Future Earth and Slow Factory are a great example of what that looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Finn. Yeah, when you said you want to give a sense of urgency and optimism, I had to think about your post about feeling overwhelmed. And that was really, you scroll and scroll and you just see all of these issues that you care about. And then, yes, you feel overwhelmed. And then it is really nice to also get, these posts about what kind of small action steps that you can take that then actually also lead to something, because we often think we need to change the world right from the beginning, but it is actually, yeah, by making small partnerships and cooperations and just raising awareness that we can already start acting. My next question go to you, Henry. The important role of museums to tackle climate change was recognized in 2018 at COP24 in Poland and was included also in the operational plan for the Paris Agreement. So can you please explain, as an expert in that field, a little bit how museums can support climate action, and also a little bit about the role of reimagining museums for climate action at COP26 this year? And of course, please also tell us a little bit how you are working towards incorporating sustainability and the SDGs into museums.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. And I'll just share my screen as well. I've only got a few slides from the beginning. Okay, so as Jessica mentions there, I work. My background is as an ecologist. And then I worked in museums for a long time, for nearly 20 years. And kind of over time, kind of realized that museums are one of these kind of quite unusual places in society where people meet as citizens, not primarily as consumers. So when we think about the shrinkage of civic space that there is across the world, places where people can just come together with strangers and have shared experiences and have an opportunity to talk about what matters to them, or to potentially have that opportunity, seems really important. And if we can think about what are the kind of organizations or institutions that can be these kind of transformers in society, and just to echo very much what Finn says there, that I absolutely believe that this isn't about the institution projecting outwards. This is about the institution facilitating dialogue. So the way that I work is I work a lot with the sustainable development goals, and just to reflect the kind of themes of what we're talking about. At the end of the day, the sustainable development goals, they look very nice, but they're 17 pictures. It's people doing things that actually affects change. So they are not an end in themselves. They're like a big puzzle that we try and work out together, or whatever other creative way we want to think about them. Whatever works, that's what we'll use. And so I'm also aware that the goals and other sustainable development agendas, human rights, disaster risk reduction, can also seem quite complicated. So what I tend to do is I write these guides to help people get started. So I've got the latest one will be out soon about mainstreaming the sustainable development goals. And as Jessica mentions there, one of the less known parts of the Paris Agreement is this thing called Action for Climate Impairment. And it's actually in the original Framework Convention from 1992. It's nearly 30 years old. So the world's governments all agreed that these 6 things are really important: education, training of staff, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation on climate change matters. They were recognized and agreed as being really important 30 years ago. It has to be said, just for whatever reason, not enough has happened. But the reason that those 6 things are there is because they relate to fundamental human rights. And there are other aspects of climate change that relate, of course, to particular rights, about the Aarhus Convention on Environmental Decision Making, the right to development, and so on. And one of the great things I think about what the UNF Framework for Climate Change, Convention for Climate Change, have been trying to do is to recognise the role that non-state actors play. And so there will be a new programme to support this, will hopefully be adopted at, or even negotiated at the next COP in Glasgow in November. But there's this thing called it's called the Katowice package, or the work programme for the Paris Agreement, is supposed to be the more operational aspect. It still isn't the how, but it's a start. And it says, you know, that these kind of institutions are important: museums, cultural and educational institutions. And whether that's recognised by governments or not ultimately doesn't really matter. What does matter is that we try to mobilise these sectors and help them understand the part that they can play, so that they can provide people with the opportunities to claim their rights. And so I'll just mention briefly a project I'm working on called Reimagining Museums for Climate Action, which is an UK Arts and Humanities Research Council funded research project, headed up by Professor Rodney Harrison at University College London, Dr. Colin Sterling at the University of Amsterdam, myself, and Rowan Gard, who's a postdoc researcher. And so this is one of the things that we can see of the potential of the internet. So we launched a design and ideas competition in May 2020 in the pandemic. We even wondered if it was the right thing to do. We had 264 submissions from 48 countries, and we've got an exhibition on show at Glasgow Science Centre at the moment. And we hope that that will still be there at the time of COP26. And the aim is that just having the competition is bringing the Paris Agreement to life, you know, creating opportunities for participation, creating opportunities for people to share their ideas, their responses, for people around the world to see them, but also to try to help mobilize the museum sector before, during, and after COP26. So we've got a website, which I've got the link on the next slide, which has a lot of the concepts from the competition, as a kind of resource for the cultural sector to use. And we'll launch a book and a kind of practical toolkit at the time of COP26. And so this is my, the best way to show it is a picture, you know, speaks 1,000 words. So if we have Glasgow Science Centre at the top left-hand image there, it's a very fantastic looking building. And one of the exhibits that there is in the exhibition comes from a Brazilian team called Existances. It's about how local communities basically have to resist market and political forces. And the exhibit they have is around these small models of these very temporary, very impermanent structures, rather than museums be big stone buildings that collect things from around the world. Thinking about them as small places close to home, which speaks to me very much of Eleanor Roosevelt's very famous quote, you know, where do human rights begin? In small places close to home. And there's just a nice symmetry between the dome, as shown there on the right-hand image, and Glasgow, and the conference centre where the COP will take place in November. So thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Yes, when you said participation opportunities, I was thinking about a design competition that the Ban Ki-moon Center launched also during the pandemic, and asked people to visualize what when they think about global citizenship, because it is, as I already said, something that is quite complex, and there's no real visualization yet. And I guess it also depends on how you think about it. There's not one concept alone. And that was very interesting to know, okay, people are thinking about this concept, they're engaging with it, and they are creating something. And I think by creating something, you are really participating in it. So thank you, all of you, for your first round of introductions. I think the audience now really knows what amazing work you are doing. And I would have another question to Yessenia, because as an environmental journalist, what kind of impact does journalism and the media have on the climate discourse? And how has the issue of storytelling around the climate emergency changed over the past years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to first remember that storytelling and journalism is a form of art, right? It's a form of communicating to your audience, of simplifying something that might be, really complex, and helping readers connect to issues that may feel far off. And so, for me, that looks a lot like talking to folks on the ground, which is a big focus of the front line. I was just in Nicaragua a couple of weeks ago, interviewing members of the Mosquito indigenous communities, asking them about the impacts that hurricanes Eta and Iota had on, their livelihoods, on their families. And these are the types of stories that I think we need more of in the media, is these on the ground reports that show the disproportionate impacts that the climate crisis is already having on the most vulnerable around the world. And stories that no longer, Finn touched on this, but stories that no longer touch on the sort of denial arguments of the oil and gas industry. For years, the media played this, two sides game, giving plenty of space to oil and gas executives and to their arguments and to their claims that climate change isn't real. And to be frank, we still see this, right, in the media, where there are publications like the Post or the New York Times that do sponsored partnerships with oil and gas companies. Emily Akin, who runs the Heated newsletter, who's an incredible journalist, recently did a big story on what's happening at the New York Times in efforts to try to change this dynamic with, the marketing teams that exist within institutions and newspapers such as the Times, so that they're no longer accepting dollars from the players that created the climate crisis. And I think that there's a growing awareness now in the media that, this isn't really acceptable anymore. And the crisis has become so severe that, the public has a reason to question your credibility if, in fact, you are publishing industry talking points or receiving dollars from them. And so there has been a shift, but I still feel that there's a lot of room to grow, especially within climate and environmental journalism. It's a very white field. Most reporters do not look like me. Most reporters are not aware of the sensitivities and the intricacies that exist within communities and across communities, and how the climate crisis is impacting their lives and intersecting with every other, socioeconomic impact that comes with something of this magnitude, right? We're talking about transit, housing, we're talking about health and the pandemic, right? Like all of these different issues that affect our lives also intersect with climate change. And for a really long time, and still today, most of the reporters telling these stories just don't have the lived experiences to, I think, really bring that nuance and humanity to their storytelling. But it's the tides are slowly shifting, and so it is a point of celebration, I think, to see this renewed attention, especially here in the U.S. nationally, on climate justice, environmental justice, on the importance of bringing diverse voices, especially those who are experiencing these impacts now. I still think there's so much work to do in this realm, and part of my work, not with Atmos actually, but I also work with the Uproot Project, which is a network for environmental journalists of color, hoping to uplift young journalists of color so that they are interested in, breaking into climate and environmental journalism, because we need more diverse reporters and writers and storytellers in this field, and artists more broadly. I had an interview with Fabiana Rodriguez, who is an incredible painter, artist, climate justice activist based out in Oakland, probably a month or so ago. And, she told me culture is what transforms the imagination, and culture is what shows us what's possible. And we need more stories that are allowing readers to open their minds and have a vision for what this world can look like that we want to see. What Finn said around another world is possible really sits with me. That was actually one of the quotes that I had on my graduation cap when I graduated university, because it's so powerful. And it's so critical for people to have an idea of what that world can and should look like. And reminding folks that there are pockets of our current world that are beginning that transformation and that are willing to challenge themselves to begin imagining, whether that's through paintings, whether that's through community organizing. But that's the kind of storytelling that I think we need more of in journalism, in like traditional journalism, and not just from outlets like Atmos, which really do challenge the norms of what journalism has been, but across the media landscape. I think we need more, just like radical imagination and creativity. And I really do feel that we are in a turning point right now where publications are beginning to recognize the value of those types of stories, especially just given how urgent and severe the climate crisis is now. Even objective journalists can no longer put their feelings aside to ignore what's happening in their own lives. So it's a critical moment, and I think that things will continue to change. I just hope it happen quickly enough.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I actually really loved that interview that you just mentioned. It was very inspirational. And I also feel like the notion of climate justice really gained momentum now in the last couple of years. And that's also why we have this climate justice webinar series now. And also the notion of intersectionality and the theory behind it, and just really seeing that everything is interconnected. I feel like it's really coming up more and more, and I'm also quite optimistic about that. We can change something. Finn, the next question is to you about the role of social media in connecting creatives and activists in the fight against climate change. How can this partnership sort of give a voice to those that are usually not heard in mainstream media, as Yessenia just mentioned as well?
Nice. Yeah, so if you come from my generation, you've grown up with the sort of full spectrum of social media emerging into the world, and there are loads of benefits and loads of negative consequences of the proliferation of social media, as many of us have become aware of, particularly in the pandemic. We potentially live in this sort of post-truth era, and so one of the things that was really important to us and is important to us at Earthrise when we're leveraging social media is to try and use it to communicate directly with an audience that's global, but to try and communicate in a way that's both easy to understand and digestible, but backed up by research or citations relating to not just our own rhetoric, but a broader consensus. And particularly when you're talking about an issue like climate change, which has this amazing history of denial and confusion that's been perpetuated by industry, that's the challenge, is how we tell the true story in a way that convinces people. And there are loads of different challenges that come with that. So the narrative that I grew up with around climate was sort of twofold. It was one, that it's something in the future, something that maybe my kids would have to worry about. And then the second was that probably polar bears in the Arctic would be where we would see the brunt of the impacts. And of course, those things both aren't true. It's happening much faster than even some of the predictions we've seen coming out recently. And this is impacting not just polar bears, but humans, and not just humans, but particular groups of humans that are the least responsible for this issue. And so these are all the stories that we're trying to, and they are big stories and they challenge people's views a lot of the time. And so that's the goal, that's the ambition, and the challenge is to leverage the incredible aspects of social media, which is that it's a globally connected network, and it's an opportunity to give anyone access to voice their opinion or perspective. All you need is some form of basic access, like a camera, even be able to record audio or create graphic work. And so we're trying to champion the best aspects of social media while keeping in mind the very real challenges that come with it. But I really agree with what Yessenia was saying in terms of storytelling on this issue. I'm fascinated by the idea that our culture is really organized around stories. Like Yuval Noah Harari talks about this really eloquently, that essentially our capacity to succeed as a human species is down to language, and language enables us to tell each other stories. And it's sort of alarming and also somewhat encouraging that things like countries, money, borders, these are all stories. And so I see a major opportunity there, that we can continue telling stories and building new stories that help us navigate a time that is very confusing and overwhelming for many people. And so yeah, we're trying to do that. And I think it's important to say that not just through social media, and we're aware of the risks of just living in a digital world, and a big part of Earthrise, or a big plan for Earthrise, is to move into the physical space, to do events. The single moment in my life that changed, that gave me agency to take action on climate change was in 2015. I was learning about this issue. I was Googling how to get more involved, and I found Al Gore's Climate Leadership Corps. And I ended up on this weekend-long training program with Al Gore, where he gave his sort of famous slideshow. And that was really transformative for me. And it was because I met a large group of like-minded people who were also daunted, also curious, and was sort of given the basic set of information that I could go forward and sort of try and translate to other people. So yeah, social media is really an amazing tool, and we've been able to connect with people that we never imagined we could have, both from the contributor side and on the audience side. But we should go beyond social media and leverage all the forms of general media and physical opportunities we have to keep talking about this issue.
Thank you, Finn. Yes, I think your last point was really important, and I would have so many follow-up questions, but we don't have enough time. And please, dear panelists, if you have some remarks or also follow-up questions to each other, please feel free to just give me a sign, because this should also be a conversation. So I will move to Henry now, since we are talking also about partnerships. How can museums collaborate effectively with one another, also with other sectors, and also with civil society to realize positive climate action? How can we bring everyone together and reach everyone?
Yeah, thanks. So I mean, just to bounce off something that Finn had said, well, two things actually, because I also did the Al Gore's training thing, but I did it online, and there were 500 of us all around the world. It was incredible. But the other one was just a remark on this idea that another world is possible. So it's to say that we need places that can do both things, that can help people understand where we are now, but also have space to imagine where they might want to get to. And that's one of my arguments for the potential role of museums. They're somewhere that's kind of outside of the day-to-day as a potentially safe space for people to explore alternatives. So absolutely not to just be about institutions that are of the past, but to be equally about the future and the past in a what we call this the big here and the long now. A sense that of something that's bigger than yourself, that you're part of something bigger than yourself in this trajectory of time. But in this your question, Jessica, there about partnerships. I mean, partnerships between museums or any institution with another institution like it is great, because also it helps to reduce the competition, because there's I would say, too much competition between institutions that gets in, if I'm honest, gets in the way. But partnerships across different sectors, they create results that can't be created alone, and those are really super important. But also to think, like, if we think from a kind of rights-based perspective of the human individual, the human person as the, you know, the central subject and beneficiary of any activity, that's not the way most of our institutions work. So if we were to think of our institutions as, you know, partnering with people as individuals, or what are the kind of intermediary structures that can help negotiate that difference between great big policy agendas and people's lived experience, because otherwise the gulf is too big. And just to keep going with this, this point that's been made a few times about the value of storytelling, it's like if policymakers use conventions and treaties, stories are the way that basically we make sense of everyday life. You know, we can share, we can create a story together, but they also help us to negotiate difference. But of course, you could say that the conventions and treaties are also the result of stories that countries tell themselves about what the problems are, stories that they tell themselves about what the future will be able to do, which has proved to be a rather problematic approach. But also to say that one of the great benefits I think that there are of using of the goals of the, I'm pointing at my flag on the wall here, is not that everybody gets to understand the goals, 17 goals and 169 targets. That might be completely irrelevant, but it's to help create the opportunities where people can explore, well, what are the goals that matter to them that touch on these more or less directly. And as someone mentioned, that one of the outcomes of the COVID pandemic is it really has helped, I think, to highlight the, you know, people, planet and prosperity. They really are the dimensions of sustainability for a reason, because they're interconnected. What would seem to be a health crisis very quickly, social economic, turns out to be because of an unsustainable relationship with nature. These are all, they're all the same problem. That's the different faces of the same problem. So yeah, finding the universal agendas, that's my short answer. So thank you.
I love how you always come back to the sustainable development goals. I mean, this is also what the Ban Ki-moon Center is working with. And yeah, it's also funny that you say that conventions and treaties are like stories. I never thought about it that way, but yeah, in a way, very, very complex stories. And now we still have one more round of questions by me before we go into the Q&A. So please just shout out your questions to the panelists in the Q&A box. And then, yes, Yessenia, the last question that I would have to you is, how can journalists and everybody, other relevant stakeholders, citizens, how can we communicate our demands in a way that we are heard and that we are taken seriously? I mean, this, yeah, seriously to policymakers, seriously to seriously in school, to any kind of leadership that has the power also to implement policies on a higher level.
Yeah, you know, I think that putting pressure on, you know, the people in power is one of the most important tasks that the everyday person can do. And this is true for journalists, as you mentioned. And I think that it starts really with first asking the right questions, right? Because if you need to first have a sense of what the demands are and how those demands may fit in line with the agenda of, you know, said politician or said corporate executive. And once you have clarity on what the answers that you need are, and trying to get those answers. I know for journalists, that's like the really what we do, right? We ask questions and we try to get the answers. Very often what I find in my reading and in my reporting is that most of these questions lead you down a path of that it leads you to money, right? It leads you to finances. We live in a society where money is power. And I think that that's a big place where we need to see both more coverage within the media and also more pressure. I mean, there's a ton of activism around, money and what money politicians are accepting, what money is funneled toward specific projects. There's the Stop the Money pipeline, which is targeting banks and what projects banks are funding and investing. And I think that by targeting money, there's a way to put even more pressure on people in power. We're also seeing success in this realm. So Harvard University just recently divested its endowment. I think it's like $42 billion away from fossil fuels. And this was like a decades-long campaign from students, organizers. And it might seem like a small thing, but this is a major institution in the US that is a direct result of pressure from their constituents, right? And, for journalists in particular, which is where I think I can offer the most expertise, I think it's important for us to make room for these organizers for their demands. So when there is a demand that comes from the people or from an organization, I do think it's on us to cover these issues and to give them a platform to speak. Line 3 has been ongoing for months now in terms of the on the ground direct action that they've been trying to raise attention for President Joe Biden to respond to. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing sort of like repeated coverage of this, given the ongoing arrests, given the ongoing actions, and given the administration's silence on this issue. There literally hasn't been like a statement from the president or the White House on this project. And so while folks on the ground are ramping up the pressure and taking action, we're not seeing sort of like an equal level attention from the media on just how severe things are getting on the ground for them. And of course, the administration's lack of response. So I think it's important for us as journalists and as people in the media to make room and give these folks a platform and cover these issues, because it's not just news, but it literally is people's lives. And people in power have the power to do something about it. And there's something to be said when folks' actions don't align with their promises, right? This is a very climate-friendly administration that is centering environmental and climate justice, and yet they haven't taken action on this particular project or even released a statement on it. And I think that's a big news item that's not getting enough play, I think, in the press. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that money, asking the right questions, and getting that work in front of the right people is critical to pushing people in power to take action. And I was thinking mostly of politicians here, but the same goes for, corporations and companies, especially with their false pledges. This is, super big in the fashion world, super big in the tech world. And very often, all this greenwashing just gets like a ton of applause without much scrutiny, without those questions of, you're saying you're going to be zero carbon. What does that actually mean? Or you have net zero goals. Like, what does that actually mean? Because net zero is not zero, right? So it's important for all of us to have those questions and to treat, every promise critically, whether that's from a politician or from a company. And of course, just give it the attention it deserves once we do get those answers, even if the answers are somewhat disappointing, which they often are when they come from people in power.
Thank you. Yes, when you said asking the right questions, I automatically thought about even empowering people to think critically. And here global citizenship education also comes to mind, and also giving people the space to ask these questions, and showing them that your voice counts as well. So yeah, that's a very, very good point that you made there. Finn, I have one last question to you. How can artists and creative studios make us reimagine our relationship with nature? And why do we need art and culture to create utopian worlds? I know we already touched upon this briefly, but would you maybe like to elaborate on this?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Yeah, so this is something I think about a lot because so I've spent the last 6 years studying in the field of architecture and design, and in that particular realm, it's a creative discipline that asks you to imagine something that doesn't exist, and then to try and put in the steps or the process by which to bring it into reality. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how we imagine the future, not just as architects and designers, but collectively. And one of the interesting things I've come across during that thinking is that the future that we know we need to bring into existence isn't one that that has no precedent in the past. It's not a utopia, like a figment of our imagination. One of the things that's become clear to me in my research is you don't have to look very far back to see a different vision for how we might live collectively. So like, you know, the industrial period is what, 300 years long. You can go before that period to think about how we would engage in ecosystems around us and the materials in a different way. And you can trace that even further back. I spent a little bit of time looking at like the sort of Enlightenment period that went through Europe in the 1600s, where ideas that humans are somehow separate from nature were proliferated, right? And this led us into the sort of the scientific revolution. And so you can go back and start to unpick again what are ultimately stories about who we are and what our role should be. And when you do this, it unlocks all sorts of different ways of imagining how we might co-inhabit the earth. And so like a great example, and I sort of slightly touched on it earlier, is indigenous culture. So my work looks a lot at regenerative design or regenerative culture. This isn't a new concept or something that's unattainable. The notion of living in a symbiosis with your natural environment to an extent where you're not just sustaining, but actively improving it, can be seen not only in the past, but even today in certain cultures, but, you know, particularly indigenous cultures. And so that's something that, you know, traditionally we've not really paid much attention to. In fact, with a great sense of ignorance, we've disregarded these ways of living, and perhaps now is a good time to look towards some of those different methods or models of engaging with nature, and then work out how they scale. And there are other examples as well. I was really fortunate a couple of years ago to go to Bhutan, which is this extraordinary Buddhist kingdom sort of nestled between China and India. And it's sort of renowned for a couple of reasons. It claims, they have a claim that they're the only carbon negative country, or carbon positive, depending which way you flip it, in the world. And this is a result of many reasons. For example, 60% of the country is protected with forest cover at all times. But these policies and their leadership environmentally stem from core ideas that they've defined in the way they run their country. And so, for example, they famously measure gross national happiness rather than gross national product. And so again, it's like, even in that, why do we measure GDP? Why is that our metric of success? It doesn't need to be. And if we start to create those shifts, which are quite systemic and a bit daunting, because that's just how we've always done things, then we open up all these amazing possibilities. So there's a massive role, not just for creative people, we're all creative in our own way, to reimagine the future. But yeah, let's do that. You know, again, like if you come from the architecture world, you're familiar with utopian renderings, right, of these sort of extraordinary futures, which are just somehow unrelatable. I'm not advocating for that. I'm advocating for taking the best ideas of things that we've already seen and perhaps have been pushed to the side and re-examining them with the absolute fundamental acknowledgement that the way we're living now is systemically broken.
Thank you. Yes, I can only agree with everything you say, and I love the way you said that we are all creative in our own way. I have to think about that every time I feel like I'm lacking inspiration in some way. Henry, my last question to you would be, how can museums democratize the production and reception of the arts so that marginalized voices are really given the space to tell their own stories? Because the last couple of years, museums have been largely criticized, and there have been calls for decolonialization. I hate that word, sorry, I can't pronounce it. Is this preventing museums from really meaningfully contributing to climate action and climate injustice?
Yeah, thanks. So I think the way I would answer that is to say that, of course, museums, as with all the other institutions that we've had for the last 100 and more years, are the institutions which have built the problem that we inhabit. That if we want a different future, we need different institutions, and maybe that involves slightly twisting the institutions that we have now, or imagining completely new forms of institution. And by institution, I don't just mean like a building with, you know, a barrier around it, but in terms of just what are the structures in society that facilitate or impede people to claim their rights. And so if we were to think of, even through our discussion today, like culture means such different things to different people, and it can be a very fugitive, complex term to deal with, that if we just end up saying that, well, culture is everything, that's very hard for people to get their head round. And often when people are talking about culture, this is a generalization now, what they mean is high culture. They mean expensive things, valuable things that cost a lot of money, that often had quite a lot of, you know, connections with some things which are very far from a rights-based kind of world. And the way I always think of this is that the right is to participate in cultural life, you know, from the Universal Declaration. It's not that people have the right to access cultural institutions. People have the right to participate in cultural life, to know their own culture and that of other people, to participate in cultural activities, and to contribute to the cultural life of the community. And perhaps if we thought more of some of these less well-remembered aspects of that, that we create more opportunities for people to contribute to the cultural life of the community. That's what I think are the kind of institutions that we need. Just a few other remarks would be that, of course, museums' origins can be said, oh, well, you know, they're rooted in colonialist history and times. But the inequality of the world is built because of decisions taken today, you know, that are reinforced and are remade and that are kept going. So I think it can be it can let institutions off the hook a bit if they think, oh, well, that's because of what happened in the past. It's like, it's not what happened in the past, it's what's happening now. And so if we want to think about one of the, arguably, what I think the best thing that these institutions in the rich global north countries can do is to talk about what's happening in the global south. They're full of material from the global south that's there, from whatever reason and route it got there. My argument would be to put it to work, you know, talk about what's happening in these places now. So like when we see countries cutting their aid budgets, it's because people don't know what aid is, how it's spent, what the need for it is. And it's not just to talk about dependency of countries, but to talk about, well, what are the historical events that tie these different countries together? And that becomes a discussion about responsibility. And that becomes a discussion about common but differentiated responsibilities. So and then that comes a kind of full circle to telling a global story, but in different ways.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important that you now gave sort of a definition of what we actually mean by culture here, because there are lots of different things that come to mind when we talk about culture. I mean, we also saw this during the pandemic when there were demonstrations because culture and the arts were not seen as something worth opening up, right? Okay, so I see we have quite some questions here, and I would move right to the first one from Pablo Davis. Hi from Colombia. Thank you for sharing these inspiring initiatives. I believe the climate crisis is really a cultural crisis. Any idea on how to measure the powerful impact of arts and culture in shaping environmental outcomes, and how to make the case of the power of the art to achieve climate action? Thank you for this question, because this is actually also one of the questions that I would have had. So who would like to take this one on?
I can kick it off.
Sure, go ahead.
Cool, thank you, Pablo, so much for your question. So, you know, one of the best examples for me of the intersection of arts and culture are the public demonstrations that we've seen taking place over the last couple of years, particularly, and you know, I can speak from two that I've been closely involved with, which is Extinction Rebellion in the UK, although they're somewhat international now, and obviously the Fridays for Future movement. And you know, what's been amazing to me is that there is a direct correlation between people getting out to the streets, holding people in power to account, being very clear about what it is their demands are, or what they'd like to see in terms of change, policy change, cultural change. And you can literally see the declaration, for example, in the UK, after the Extinction Rebellion and the Friday for Future movement, there was a declaration of a climate emergency in Parliament. Now, has action followed that? Not sufficiently, but you can see these amazing markers at like the sort of political level. And of course, Greta's an interesting example here. You know, when we creatively express ourselves in community, as a group, in the general public, in streets, which we all have, most of us have the agency to do, you can see a direct impact in some of the policy shifts that are starting to happen, and we have done, and that should give us enthusiasm to keep going.
Thank you, Finn. Yes, yeah, Henry, please go ahead.
I go next. Sorry, just to add on to this, that I think the question becomes, it's not if the culture and the arts contribute to climate action, but it's which forms of culture and arts. Because we can see, as I mentioned before, that many of the things which are in museums are associated with very extractive worldviews and so on. And then I think that then is like what we can explore. It's like, well, which forms can help make a difference, but to people, so that it's not about the cultural sector making a case for itself, but about creating opportunities for people to talk about, well, what, you know, how have these opportunities supported and empowered them? That would be my comment.
Yessenia, please. I think you also wanted to answer.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know, there are also like organizations, research institutes that measure some of this stuff, which I think is really fascinating and great for folks to check out. I wrote about the Netflix show Sweet Tooth earlier this year because I was just obsessed. That's usually when I get into like the more pop culture stuff on the front line, is when I'm watching something that just like touches me. And I spoke to Dr. Beth Carlin, who's the founder and CEO of the Sea Change Institute, which like measures how media, whether that's shows, documentaries, TV, film, can literally affect behavioral change. And, you know, they like show someone a show and then see how their behavior changes in the weeks and months that follows. And at least with TV and film, there have been some measurable impacts on how it affects people. And especially when we have these sort of like fantastical sci-fi fictional stories, more so than the documentaries that we may more typically see covering these issues. And I think this brings us back to like that artistic, like imaginative role, the importance of having that radical imagination in storytelling, whether that's on screen or on, in print. Because when people read about things that don't currently exist or watch worlds that don't currently exist, there is like a switch that goes off psychologically in the brain. And I think it's really, really fascinating and doesn't get enough credit given how much TV and film we watch. There's just like so much room there, I think, to begin shifting the culture, whether that's just like the portrayal of nature in the movies we watch, or, what they're telling us to buy or to not buy, right? Like the normalization of consumption in the films we watch. So we definitely encourage you all to look into Sea Change Institute, and I'm sure that there are others out there as well who have research and reports on this topic.
Thank you. I think we'll all watch even more Netflix now. Okay, so the next, I can actually take 2 questions at once. So how do you take care of your mental health? I find myself feeling very anxious and quite hopeless when it comes to finding a way of acting in order to tackle the climate crisis. And maybe also, what does one tell younger generations to give them hope about the future? I think these 2 questions go well together.
I can jump in again quickly. So this is something I feel really passionate about because it's very personal, as I suppose mental health often is. But on the journey I've gone through, I've experienced all sorts of different emotions as I sort of come to terms with some of the predictions to the future and the sort of reality of the crisis. And so depression and anxiety are things that have been very present on my own journey. And I've learned a couple of things as I've sort of battled with those. And one is something that was taught to me by a psychologist called Caroline Hickman. She's completing her PhD at the University of Bath, and I recommend looking her up. But she speaks about the fact that it's healthy to feel emotionally distressed by the reality of the climate crisis, because it means you're coming to terms with the sheer scale of what we're dealing with here. And so, it's not the most encouraging answer, but the first step is to welcome any sort of deep emotional response to engaging with the climate crisis. And, we can sort of move forward from there. That's like the 5 stages of grief, for example. And I've certainly myself, and I've seen others sort of go through those stages, ending at acceptance. And then the other thing is just that we should make this part of the conversation, and that's why community is so important. That's for us like a digital community, and also hopefully a physical one, is that we should cultivate a space where it's safe to talk about how we're experiencing the crisis. We should keep in mind that some of our mental health issues stem from worrying about the future, while people today are literally suffering in real time. And so that's a whole nother perspective on it there. But yeah, I feel really passionate about mental health. We're failing miserably to deal with it in our sort of Western medical model, and we should bring it firmly into the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to agree with everything that Finn just said. And this is something that I write about pretty frequently on the front line, because I think all of us, I'm sure all of us on this panel, but perhaps all of you here joining us, deal with the anxiety and just like despair that I think is inherent in this work, if you care about this issue. And in some of my reporting, I've talked to psychologists about, what should people do? And as Finn said, it's a big part is just like accepting, right, the emotion. But, I spoke to an Indigenous psychologist for a story last week or a couple of weeks ago, and it's about like embodying self-care, not this glorified, like luxurious self-care of, going to like $1 million spa or something, but, taking a break, taking a walk, trying to connect to nature really is one of the best things you can do for yourself. Sitting in a quiet place. This might sound like obvious, but truly, like, this is what the experts recommend, meditating. And one thing that I also hear is, connecting to other people, which Finn also touched on. It's really, really critical to not be alone with your emotions. This is something that I talk about with my own therapist, because that's something that I struggle with, is feeling really isolated in my emotions. I'm a Latina, and unfortunately, most of my friends from the hood just don't think about this stuff. They have like way too many other things to worry about than thinking about the climate crisis right now. until, it actually affects them. And, I'm often just like the one friend in my group who's like, oh my gosh, it's been raining so much this summer. Like, are y'all scared of another Sandy? Because I keep thinking we're going to have another Hurricane Sandy this year. And when Ida hit, I was like, I told y'all this was going to happen. I've been like so anxious all summer, and everyone just like, oh my God, like we didn't even stop to think about this. But plugging in and having like your people that you can talk to about this without feeling like you're screaming in a vacuum can be really grounding and just like really reassuring, so that you don't feel like you're just dealing with all of this by yourself in your head. And you remember that you're not alone in these feelings. This is a feeling that's, unfortunately really shared experience. And it's important to share that experience with one another so that you can support each other and, hopefully learn mechanisms to navigate those emotions.
Yeah, I think I would just mirror pretty well everything that's been said there. Is that part of my experience of this is that it's not just about stopping things going wrong and preventing negative impacts on myself. That because I'm really lucky that over time I've built a really fantastic network of the most unbelievably amazing and inspiring people. And I think that's the thing, is like people are out there who are interested and concerned about the same things. And that would be my advice, would be just to try to find even just a few of them. It's like, this idea that you can't expect people to go further than you're prepared to go yourself. But the other side of it is you don't have to solve everything on your own. This is the reality that we live in. But I also agree with very much with being realistic about the expectations that you place upon yourself, and taking time to do a variety of things, and doing, if you've got access to a park or a garden or nature or any of these things, and just to take some time out of it, because I don't think it's possible to do it all of the time because it's too exhausting. So yeah, be kind to yourself. That would be my answer.
Thank you to all three of you, and I will jump right to the next questions because they just keep coming in. How can we reach those who are the most oppressed in our society and affected by climate change to make their voices heard and put their stories in the center, on the table to the stakeholders and governments that are in power?
Yeah, I don't mind taking this one on. I think that asking yourself this question is an important first step. And, it just really starts with reaching out. And of course, having that sensitivity and having that cultural knowledge of the communities that you're reaching out to, so that you're not going in blind. Sarah, I'm not sure, what your background is, but it's important when you're communicating and reaching out to different communities, especially Black, Indigenous, or other communities of color, that you're, mindful of, folks' time, their experiences, and approaching them with that intentionality. But truly, I've gotten the sense that people really appreciate when you are clear to them that, I want to get your story in front of people. I want to help address the issue that you and your community are facing. I'm not from here, but this issue sounds really important. I want to get it to a national audience. Whatever the reasons are for your outreach, I think being really genuine and authentic in that, and communicating wherever there may be some space to learn more. Like if there's something that they talk about that you don't know, asking those questions and being really honest about what you know, what you don't know, and what you want to know from them is a really great way to connect. And usually, there's a lot of community groups who work really closely with residents and community members, organizations. Most cities have sort of social justice or like ethnic or cultural groups that work really closely with specific communities. And so being really specific in who you want to talk to and reaching out to the groups that may be in close contact with them is a great way to find those voices and center them in your stories. Hopefully that's a way to bring them to governments and other institutions to be able to listen more to those perspectives.
I can add on quickly. So this is, I mean, it's a really great question, and it's something that sits at the core foundation, or at least the core ambition of when we started Earthrise. I think we were quite impacted from things like Pass the Mic that we saw happening during the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'll speak from my own position here of realizing I was in a position of privilege with a platform that could reach people, and that perhaps there were other stories beyond my own that needed that deserved the opportunity to be platformed. And so we work hard to find, and normally it's through Instagram, we try and find activists, people who are starting to use the platform, perhaps struggling to gain traction. We reach out to them and we literally work together to try and create some sort of format by which they can share not only their own story, but the story of their local community. And a good example of this is the most recent post on Earthrise from an amazing activist called Nina Gualinga, who's Ecuadorian, and she has sort of sent us this Reels video she put together from a protest in Brasilia for Indigenous Women's March. And this is literally exactly why we started Earthrise, you know, to be able to create a platform where people like Nina could share in real time something that they were experiencing. The founders of Earthrise are from London. This is in Brazil, somewhere totally alien to us, and talk about her experience and the experience of her community. So I feel that's really important. And then the last thing I'll just say, because it feels so relevant, is that this is where, with something like COP26 happening in later this year in November, this is exactly what we need to be doing. You know, this is a group of very powerful people from around the world that are literally making the policy decisions that will decide the fate of our future. And it's our responsibility and challenge to bring some of those voices to that table. And we're doing this in a very literal way at the moment with and I can announce this, it's just got announced last week, but we're doing a show with YouTube called Seat at the Table, where we're literally receiving submissions from people around the world with local camera crews that are articulating what it means for them to be experiencing the climate crisis, and cutting it together into a film and showing it at COP. And so like, it's literally about being quite, not forceful, but really working hard to make sure these stories are seen where they need to be seen and where they'll have an impact.
If I can just to keep going with this, because of course one of the challenges is that governments will never legislate for what they don't think people will vote for. And so I would think here that the answer is not just about how do we make sure that governments and other institutions listen to marginalized voices. It's how do we make sure that the more privileged in society, recognize their role and so on. Because I think it has to be not just about imagining the institution as it is, that you somehow parachute the oppressed into within that whole framework, which is about oppression, but it's like recognizing we have to change the institutions. So yeah, that'd be my comment.
Thank you. The next question is from Tanya, based in India. My question is to both Finn and Yessenia. How can we make sure we are able to communicate about climate mitigation to the most affected communities? In countries like India, there is a huge gender disparity gap as well. So women remain the most vulnerable, not to mention the huge digital divide. But youth climate action remains a promising strategy. What do you think could help in communicating to these vulnerable communities? A very good question. Who would like to take this one on?
I don't mind starting. I guess for me, when I think about effective communication, it's about figuring out what's going to tug at the reader's heartstrings. So if you're trying to reach these communities that are most affected by climate change, I would suggest, communicating, telling their stories, right? Like connecting with them, that you're trying to tell their stories, and then helping them connect with the stories of others as well. I also do think, though, that it's tough when you're talking about communities most affected by climate change, especially in a place like India, because there's just like clear inequity in who has access even to like the internet, right? To be able to read these stories if they live online. How many of these folks have like a smartphone to have access to Instagram to read these stories? And so I don't know that, you know, the typical sort of storytelling approach that I would take is the most effective when you're talking about communicating with folks in these most affected communities. And it might just be a matter of like building connections and partnerships and community, because you know, at the end of the day, trust is at the heart of how you can have effective communications with people. And if you're coming in to communicate about climate mitigation to these most affected communities and you're a stranger, you know, it might not land well. And the same goes for journalists and reporters and storytellers who are trying to do this work. So I think that the first step really starts with trust, and hopefully, you know, telling them that you want to get their stories out there, which might help put this issue on their radar, though I imagine this is very much already on the radar of folks who are experiencing it. Yeah, this is a tough one for me. And Finn, maybe you have some more thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything you just said. The only angle I was going to throw in on this, I think we need to be having a bigger conversation about resilience, and climate migration is important to talk about here. It's a way for us to really understand the human impact of the climate crisis. By 2050, we're looking at 1 billion or more refugees moving across the planet, which is somewhat overwhelming. Resilience is a really interesting area that we need to focus more on. And if we think of it as like the ability to adapt to change while maintaining like some sort of core structure or function, then this is a tool set that's useful for people, but we should think about it not as an externally imposed idea, but the cultivation of practices that are already traditional or indigenous to a certain group of people. And so like you can look towards ideas like permaculture or anything really that's working with the natural systems, natural living systems as a really good way to try and adapt to systemic changes. So I think there's a sort of the thing with resilience and the thing with migration is that it impacts people in very different ways depending on where they live in the world. And so we need sort of like the deployment of localized workshops, groups, communities that can help help communities develop a sense of resilience in a way that is appropriate and applicable to their geography, their culture. But I genuinely have faith there that if we work with nature rather than against it, we can create amazing resilience in the face of some of the changes that we know are going to happen. And we're doing people an injustice if we're not having this conversation, because at this point, at this stage in the game, we know this change is coming.
Thank you. And there is room for one last question, and this one goes to Henry. Aside from hosting competitions, have there been any other modalities that piqued your interest enacted by museums or artists that promote climate imagination or the possibility of another world via a digital space or medium? As a cultural worker, this has definitely been a pressing challenge during the pandemic. So this one is from Corinne.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. I think I'll give you an example. Is a project that was done in Australia, which was about collecting people's experiences of the fires in their southern summer. And the reason I select that example is because it wasn't just, I don't mean just, collecting images and stories to document what had happened. It was consciously done to help prepare people for when it happens again. So about how cultural activities can help people share their story and build community, but also to be that resource that helps prepare people and be more resilient for the future. I thought was very positive. I mean, just to say, like through the competition that we ran, I mean, we had all kinds of suggestions for this idea of reimagining museums for climate action. It's really not just about reimagining a museum. It's about reimagining the relationship between institutions and society. And so, I mean, the website has lots of these huge, fantastic ideas that I can take zero credit for, that I'd really recommend people have a look at for a bit of inspiration. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Time for one more question to Finn from Valentina. From your different experiences in design, what has been a thing that you've learned or found out that pushed you even more on this journey on fighting against the climate crisis?
It's a good question. There was a similar one above as well about how architecture had shaped my perspective on the climate crisis. I think the thing for me that I've realized, I started like every naive student, very excited that, maybe perhaps one building could sort of change the world. And the more I learned, the more I understood the systemic nature of the problem we're facing. And something I've realized, and this is really obviously not applicable just to me as a designer, but people from all sorts of different backgrounds, is that and I touched on this earlier, but I just really want to mention it again. We live in a set of systems that we have mainly often designed ourselves, and this is what architecture is. It's the aggregation of systems at many different scales. And so what design's taught me is to go much, much, much bigger than, say, the system of a building, and look at the system that we've constructed around us, the way we live our lives, and realize that it's broken first and foremost, and so within that is an opportunity for change. And where do we draw inspiration when we're thinking about designing for the future? Nature, right? To recognize that we ourselves exist within systems, living systems. We depend on this sort of equilibrium, this balance, in order to function, and so we have to find a way to design ourselves into those and to be stewards of the systems that exist. So I think that's really my big takeaway from design, is that we are all have agency to start to manipulate the systems around us. Yeah.
Thank you, Finn. And Yessenia, someone asked about, I just lost the message about your books and whether you could make a recommendation about some books that inspired you.
Yes, I actually just
question.
I sent Pablo a private response.
Great.
I had suggested, everything Octavia Butler. I'm a big fiction fiend. Parable of the Sower. I read it last year, and it was just perfect timing with everything that was going on. If you all aren't familiar, it's a book set pretty much 2030s that looks at post-apocalyptic dystopia where wildfires are rampant, and it follows the story of a young Black woman, and it really touches on themes of race, climate, economic disparity, climate calamity, all in one, and it's just so well written. I'm a big fiction person, so would definitely suggest some of Octavia Butler's science fiction. I'm currently reading Aja Barber's Consumed, which is set to come out soon. So definitely would recommend you all to get that once it's out in, I think it publishes in the US this week, but I think that you all in the UK have to wait a month for it to print out there. But that's a nonfiction book, and I'm really liking it so far. So definitely suggest reading more of Aja Barber if you're not familiar. She's I guess a sustainable fashion expert, I would say. So she's great, and yeah, that's what I'm reading right now, and maybe Finn and Henry have some book suggestions as well.
I'm on biodiversity and climate change. It's my two big things. Fantastic book by Thomas Lovejoy.
I'm a big fan. I've assumed so many different narratives and perspectives on the climate crisis, but I got started reading Naomi Klein, so I'd really recommend some of her work. This changes everything. It's like a sort of seminal piece trying to get your head around this issue.
And then we also have one question. I think this is a really nice closing question. What excites you about the future? So to wrap this up in maybe a bit of a positive note, please, whoever wants to go first.
I'll just throw in a very quick thing. Look, I think I am fundamentally and profoundly excited by the opportunity to change. I think we have because we've left it so late, we have literally no choice but to make change very quickly. And within that comes unlimited
just the potential is absolutely limitless. You know, they're just the further we go into the future, that boundless opportunity and capacity for change is fantastic.
Yeah, I'm really just excited seeing the grassroots organizing that's just really coalescing and building steam, particularly from the young people. You know, I often struggle with this
read and watch and yeah, just take in as much art and culture as you can, and yeah, let's reimagine a different world together. And we will have our last webinar on the 12th of October with 3 amazing young activists, where we will discuss challenges and opportunities, and it will be just as inspiring as this one, I promise. So thank you very much again for the speakers, and wishing everyone a good night for here in Vienna, and yeah, a good rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.